Buongiorno, buona mattinata. Bene, continuiamo con gli appuntamenti del Food and Science Festival. Faremo un lungo viaggio, un viaggio anche molto importante attraverso molti cibi e tradizioni del mondo. Cibi e tradizioni che si portano dietro non soltanto fattori culturali, ma anche modalità di produzione, relazioni con fauna e flora che possono in qualche modo diventare un patrimonio e lo devono diventare soprattutto in virtù di quelli che sono poi i cambiamenti e le grandi trasformazioni che il nostro pianeta sta subendo sotto i nostri occhi. Lo faremo con Saladino. Saladino è un giornalista, fa numerosi programmi sulla BBC, su Radio 4 e anche su BBC World. Ha pubblicato questo libro che si intitola Mangiare fino all'estinzione, i cibi più rari del mondo e perché dobbiamo salvarli. E questo è l'ultimo libro che ha pubblicato anche altri libri. Con questo libro ha vinto numerosi premi internazionali, sono diversi, quindi evito di fare l'elenco, però siamo molto felici di averlo intercettato qui in Italia perché è a Roma a parlare in un evento FAO che tratta proprio questi temi, quindi è stato così gentile da muoversi e arrivare qui oggi per noi a raccontarci cosa racconta in questo libro e quanto la biodiversità sia un tema centrale che parte anche dalla tavola e dal cibo che mangiamo. È un intervento in inglese, ci sono le cuffie per chi non è riuscito a prenderlo o non lo sapeva, all'ingresso ci sono delle cuffie con una traduzione in simultanea. Dopo la presentazione sarà una presentazione, dopo ci sarà la possibilità di fare domande che possono essere fatte assolutamente in italiano, quindi non preoccupatevi, perché Dan avrà un traduttore, anche lui in simultanea, quindi sarà molto felice di dialogare e confrontarsi con voi. Io non mi dilungo altro, invito a sedere sul palco Dan Saladino. Hi Dan, welcome on stage.
Hi.
And thank you for being here with us today. Stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in Mantova. It's my first time. I'm already starting to plan my next visit when I can stay for longer. It's also great to be invited to a festival that is interested in food and science. And as I'll hopefully explain in the next 20 or so minutes, I think that's a reason for optimism. I think we are learning so much about our relationship with food, the way in which we've changed the planet, and also some of the solutions for the future. So I want to tell the story of how I came to write a book about the world's rarest or most endangered foods, and why I think knowing the stories of these disappearing foods is essential for all of us. Bit of background, I make radio programs as my main job. So for 25 years, I've worked for the BBC, 10 years as a news journalist, and then 15 or so years ago, I became a journalist specializing in food and farming. And I was very lucky enough to be invited onto a program that was created by a journalist called Derek Cooper, who in the 1970s traveled around Britain with a camera to make a television series as Britain's food traditions were disappearing. So his idea was to make a television series as a last chance to see before these traditions disappeared. And then in 1979, to keep the campaign going, he launched a BBC program that goes out once a week. It's like a documentary program. Because it's radio, not television, we don't really do recipes and cooking. What we do is the economics, the history, the science, the culture of food. So he was a pioneering journalist, and I'm following in his tradition. As you can guess from my name as well, I have some Italian ancestry as well. So my father grew up in Sicily, in the southwest, in a town called Ribera, the Città dell'Arancia, and apologies for not speaking Italian. My mother's English. My dad ended up working in restaurants, and so in the evenings when I was home from school, we spoke English, unfortunately, much to my shame. But Sicily is important. I left the 1970s of, I would say, black and white British food, And in the summer, I arrived in Sicily to the colors, the noise, the conversations, sometimes arguments around food of the Sicilian table. And I would spend summers with my nonna, and I would get to spend time on farms, which was really important. And it was in Sicily, when I was making one of my early programs for the food program, that I came across the Arc of Taste, Slow Food's Arc of Taste, which had been created in Italy in the 1990s because Carlo Petrini and some colleagues involved with slow food at that time realized that there were flavors, varieties of food, breeds of animals that were disappearing from the different regions of Italy. And so they created a Noah's Ark of Taste to collect the stories and to make people aware so they could actually take action and do something about these disappearing traditions. The Ark of Taste grew from the 1990s to become a catalogue of endangered foods that covers the world. So there are now more than 5,500 identified endangered foods from more than 150 countries. We know they exist because they have been nominated by somebody who's trying to save them. So it's an important catalogue that has launched a global project involving activism. But in my research to explain why is diversity important, why has there been so much food and farming diversity around the world, I traveled to different places to collect stories, to make sense of the story of our history as humans. And one of the places I went to is in East Africa, Tanzania, near Lake Eyasi. This is a place where some of the last of Africa's hunter-gatherers exist today. Thoroughly modern human beings who are opting to live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which could be it is the most successful human lifestyle to date, if you think back through 2 million years of evolutionary history. Just 10 or 12,000 years of this experiment we call agriculture. So I spent some time with the Hadza, and one of the stories that makes its way into the book is the conversation that takes place between humans and this bird, the honey-guide bird, scientific name indicator. And the hunter-gatherer will go into the savannah in search of their number one favorite food, which is honey. We think honey is actually one of the important foods that drove human evolution. It could take a hunter-gatherer hours to find a bee's nest high up in the baobab trees. But somehow, we think 700,000 years ago or more, when humans started to control fire and smoke, a conversation started to take place between the human and the bird. So the human will whistle a particular tune, and in response, the honey-guide bird will come and then take the Hadza hunter-gatherer to a tree where there is a bee's nest and honey. The hunter-gatherer will use smoke to get access to the honey and then leave something behind for the honey-guide bird. And we think, because of the pressures now bearing down on the Hadza, in our lifetime, this conversation between human and bird could end. So we think almost 1 million years of a conversation that in our lifetimes will come to an end. Another important feature to understand about the Hadza is that they have a potential menu across a year of 800 different plant and animal species. And perhaps one day you can take some time and just try and calculate how many plant and animal, plant varieties and animals are in your diets. It will be nowhere near 800, I promise you. So my argument really is that diversity is a really essential component in our evolutionary history. And the science is telling us that it's an important feature of our health as well. So, and I know elsewhere in this festival, people are talking about the gut microbiome, the trillions of microbes we all host that interact not only with our body, but also the food that we consume. And the science is telling us that the more diverse our diets, the more diverse the population of microbes in our guts, the more beneficial that is for our physical and mental health. When archaeologists discover so-called bog bodies, so extremely well-preserved bodies, some thousands of years old, in moist, mud-like conditions, they also find huge amounts of diversity in their stomachs. This is Tolland man, discovered in the 1950s in Denmark, 2,500 years old, 40 different plant species, the seeds of which were in his gut. So complexity of our food is important. Diversity exists around the world. And that's also reflected in the different plants that we have found, but we are losing. One of which, that's in my book, can be found in southern Mexico, close to where maize, corn, was first domesticated 8,000 years ago. This is an extremely remote mountainous village in which the soil is very poor, and it's been isolated from most of the other communities in this part of Mexico. However, in the late 1970s, Western scientists arrived in the village and they discovered a very strange looking type of maize, 16 feet tall, dripping a bizarre liquid, mucus, from roots that weren't below ground but were coming out of the stem of the maize. It was only 5 years ago that we had the analytical techniques to understand that this mucus contains bacteria that's being fed sugars by the plant, and in return the bacteria is fixing nitrogen in the air and fertilizing the plant. It's a self-fertilizing cereal crop, which is unheard of. So this one village, over thousands of years, had domesticated and saved this rare plant, as all the other maize in all the other villages was quickly switching to modern varieties of maize, but that were also dependent on fossil fuel dependent fertilizers. We think there are 6,000 edible plants. We have now shrunk that down to a core of 9 to 12 plants that feed most of the world, 3 of which, wheat, rice and maize, provide more than 50%, close to 60% of the calories for the world. So we are losing diversity around the world, and also as that happens, we are seeing a greater concentration of power in the global food system. So the source of much of the world's food, seeds, is now in the hands of just 4 corporations. Half of the world's cheeses use the starter cultures or the enzymes produced by one company. And in terms of global pork production, that now is based mostly around one breed of pig, and the global poultry industry is dependent on just 3 genetic lines of poultry owned by 2 companies. And most famously, although there are 1,500 different types of bananas, there is one globally traded banana called the Cavendish, which is clonally propagated. So it's not grown from seed, it's reproduced from the suckers of one plant to create another, so it's genetically uniform. And the consequence of that is that the Cavendish is now in decline because a fungal disease is starting to infect the global crop. People are now working behind the scenes to figure out how do we save the future of the globally traded banana. And it's not just bananas, it's also wheat, rice, potatoes. The world's most important foods are now increasingly susceptible to aggressive forms of crop disease, plant disease, and climate change is also influencing the spread and the impact of those diseases. So I wanted to understand, well, how did our diversity of different foods around the world begin? And you can go back to the 3 different main centers of origin. So I mentioned maize and beans and squashes in Mexico. You have rice and soy and other many other plants in China. In the Fertile Crescent, we have the Neolithic package: wheat and barley and chickpeas and lentils, as well as some of the animal breeds that we depend on today. And they are the result of interaction between humans and wild grasses over thousands of years. But 10, 12,000 years ago, that interaction became more complex, and humans started to select and then create the domesticated crops we have today. And those crops spread out of the Fertile Crescent, and whenever they arrived in a different location, the farmers would plant them and harvest them and select them, and the environment would shape which varieties or which genetic traits survived. And so we end up with huge amounts of diversity of those crops around the world. One of which I went to Turkey to find. So the earliest types of wheat were iron corn and emmer. Emmer wheat is grown also in Italy, but I went to eastern Turkey, where it's thought that in this community I arrived at, farmers had been growing emmer wheat for 8,000 years. Emmer is a really hardy type of wheat, husked. It's got a husk, so it's got a shell around the grain, and it's possible it's been grown there for 7,000-8,000 years. But emmer is the wheat that the ancient Egyptians were farming and eating. So the people who built the pyramids were emmer farmers, and also around Europe as well. Emmer was the most important wheat for thousands of years. And not only is there an emotional connection with this wheat, so the farmers described to me the way they love the look of the wheat in the fields and the smell and the aroma as it cooks. The reason it's such an important crop in that part of Turkey is it's quite damp and high altitude. And if you put a modern wheat in that environment, it would be quickly overwhelmed by fungal diseases, and you would need to spray lots of chemicals to try and grow the wheat. So it was adapted over thousands of years. But not only is there the loss of these wheats around the world, so this is an extremely rare wheat today in Turkey, but also the knowledge of how to mill and process this wheat is disappearing. There's only one miller left who knows how to work with that wheat. But chefs, I think, are important storytellers, and there are chefs in Istanbul who are helping the farmers make a business out of saving this wheat. And as this particular chef told me, we feel like we are a bridge between the past and the present by helping these farmers. Nothing I'm saying today is new, because 100 years ago, a Russian botanist, Nikolai Vavilov, was traveling around the world, crossing 5 continents, in search of seeds to save them into a seed bank that existed in St. Petersburg. And he ended up sacrificing his life to this mission to save plant diversity. It's a story that's too complicated and important for me to tell in this short space of time, but it's a story that I tell in the book of this dedication because of this sense of urgency that he understood existed in the 1920s and 30s. Diversity was also important after the Second World War, when crop breeders started to think, how can we or how should we feed the world? And one of the most famous crop breeders was Norman Borlaug, who was an American working in Mexico, and he took different types of wheat from around the world, Mexico and Japan, and bred a type of wheat that didn't grow so tall that if you fed it lots of the new chemical industrially produced fertilizers, it would fall over. And also it had some crop resistance. And so successful was the work of Borlaug in the Green Revolution that the wheats that he produced spread around the world, through Asia first and then into Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, which is when we start to see landscapes changing, not only in northern Europe, in the UK and elsewhere, but also in Italy as well, as these wheats and these new varieties arrive. There were people who were saying this is a problem way back in the 1970s. So Jack Harlan was another American scientist who believed in a paper that he published in 1972 called The Genetics of Disaster, that these resources, and by that he means diversity of food and seeds, These resources stand between us and catastrophic starvation on a scale we cannot imagine. That if we end up with a world in which we have a small number of crops, all genetically similar, that if there's a problem that hits one field, it could hit all of the fields and spread quickly. And then that's a fragile situation for humans to be in, to be depending on this genetic uniformity. In the 1970s, because of partly what Jack Carlin was saying, a big mission was undertaken to collect seeds from different parts of the world. So when people ask me how much diversity have we lost, it's very hard to put figures on. What you can say is that a European farmer today might have a selection to make of wheat that is around 10 genetically similar types of wheat. In the Arctic Circle, down a tunnel, inside a seed vault that's called the Svalbard Seed Vault, there are more than 200,000 accessions or collections of wheat from around the world. That's how much diversity once existed. And we've shrunk that down to a very, very narrow number. Some of the seeds in the seed vault will have traits that are good for drought tolerance, for less rain, for increasing temperatures. Some of them might produce wheat that is more nutrient dense than other wheats. Another story in the book it comes from southern Germany, and the story of a farmer who set out to bring a food back from extinction. I mentioned about the Neolithic package containing lentils, and this is a farmer who was growing a particular type of lentil when he was a child. His family farm grew a lentil that was perfectly adapted to a mountainous area. It went extinct in the 1960s, and he set about trying to find it. And he traveled to Russia in search of a lentil that he hoped somebody had visited the village to collect and save for the future. And I think this picture tells an amazing story for me, because this farmer being reunited with the seeds, the lentil, in this seed bank in Russia. And it tells the story of it's not just a sense that this food is his inheritance. It's also the idea that he is reclaiming not only a way of farming, but also a way of life. And he encouraged other farmers in Germany to grow this lentil, and his story in turn inspired people in other parts of Europe, including the UK, to look back through the history records of what we used to eat when it came to pulses, so peas, beans and lentils. And now there are really successful businesses growing historical peas, beans and lentils. And we in the UK lost that tradition completely, and we're now reclaiming that. I mentioned the Neolithic package also contained the farm animals that we have around the world today, so the cattle, the goats, the sheep and the pigs. The Green Revolution changed the way we grow crops in the 1960s. Earlier, in the Midlands of England, a farmer was using scientific principles to try and select different breeds of animal that gave more meat or more wool, and his name was Robert Bakewell. His work in the 18th century would give us, in the 20th century, chickens that can be grown in 35 days to give us meat. So a complete transformation of the physiology of animals starts with the breeding programs of Robert Bakewell in the 18th century. So I wanted to find some other meat traditions and relationship with animals. I travelled to the north of Europe, to the Fær Øer Islands, so close to west of Denmark and Iceland, a very inhospitable place, no trees, it's very hard to grow other types of food. You could only really survive with animals. Animals would be able to eat the pasture and convert it into milk, which you could turn into cheese, and also their meat, once they had provided all the other valuable things, it was only then that you would think about the meat from that animal. So on the Fær Øer Islands, they would take a mature sheep, 5 years old, 6 years old, and they would hang the leg in this building called a chatla, which has gaps in the walls. This allows the salty sea air to blow into the space, and slowly over 8-9 months, the meat will ferment, slowly ferment, to be preserved. And it's an ingenious way in which nature is being used by humans to produce something that would enable them to survive over the winter. Somebody who's tasted it has described it as tasting something a cross between Parmesan and death. I know what the cheese tastes like. I have no idea what the other thing tastes like. But when I tasted it, it was quite sweet, had a fermented taste, but I thought it was delicious. A wonderful survival food, that it also acts as a reminder of the importance of animals, the close connection we had with them, and also the fact that they were so precious that we wouldn't slaughter them until the end of their lives, and so much has changed. And it's the same with cheese, that when humans left the Fertile Crescent and other places, it was only possible to survive and exist in mountainous areas if you had animals with you. And we did this, or our ancestors did this ingenious thing of, again, allowing the animals to capture the energy from the pasture, the nutrients from the soil, to convert the grasses, the pasture, into milk that high up in the mountains they would then preserve in the form of cheese, which they could then take back down to the village and survive, again, the winters when there was so little food. And around the world, we are losing the diversity of that connection between the breeds and the landscapes, the pastures. And this is a cheesemaker in England, the last cheesemaker to be making an unpasteurized milk cheese using the recipe for Stilton. It's now illegal for him to call his cheese Stilton because the cheese industry has protected the name Stilton only for pasteurized cheese. But he is convinced that his cheese, because it is made with unpasteurized milk, still keeps the link to the landscape, the pasture, the soil, and everything else that shapes the milk and the microbes that helps him to produce his cheese. Just to finish off, I want to refer to the work of somebody who isn't somebody who thinks or writes about food too much, but actually thinks about networks. Human-made, and networks also found in nature as well. And this is Albert Laszlo Barabasi, based in the US. Very interested in complexity and the history of science in the 20th century, which he argues has been reductionist, that we have taken these big breakthroughs in science and technology, embraced them, and excluded the complexity elsewhere. And I love this quote where he says, like a child taking apart a favorite toy, we have no idea of how to put it back together again. That's the idea of this. We've explored nature. We think we've understood nature, but we failed to understand nature as a whole. And in riding reductionism, we run into the hard wall of complexity, which is where I think we've arrived now in the 21st century, that complexity is now catching up with us in terms of, as I mentioned, the crop diseases, in terms of the impact of our farming systems on the planet, and also the impact of the modern day food system on public health. So all of the public health issues, type 2 diabetes, for example, obesity, all these things are a consequence of the food system we have created. This is a brand new image created by a team working on something called the periodic table of food. And this is a map of the chemical compounds that exist in our food that we are now only beginning to map. So when people create dietary guidelines for a nation, they might track maybe 100 or 150 different constituent parts of a food, maximum. The team here are mapping 10, 20,000 chemical compounds, so we can understand a carrot grown in one system or a tomato grown in one system. Does it have a different nutrient density to another system? Does one variety of potato have different properties to another? With new science, we can start to unravel this. We can also understand what is in or what is not in the more processed foods that most of the world is now leaning towards. So science is going to inform us of the complexity of our food. And we can start to make decisions, we hope, based on that new science. Finally, my new project is going away from individual foods to looking at landscapes. Here is one not too far from here of the terracing that exists in winemaking. This has been recognized by the United Nations in its project of heritage agricultural landscapes. And I'm now starting to travel to different parts of the world to understand how these systems work. And what can we learn from them today? So I've just recently been in Mexico City. The Chinampas are farming islands created in the lakes near Mexico City by the Aztecs 1,000 years ago, and it's a self-fertilizing system. It's a fantastic, wonderful way of seeing food production close to a city. So I'm optimistic about the future. I think science will reveal to us more about the wonders and the ingenuity of our ancestors. And again, with science and technology, I think we should be able to embrace these traditions and take them into the future, because the track we are now on is not sustainable. And also, do we really want to live in a world in which more and more people around the globe are not only listening to the same music, watching the same films and television programs, wearing the same fashion, but also eating exactly the same food and farming in identical ways? That is not the human story, which is why I think we should save diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. This is yours. Really impressive and mindful. Thank you very much. So, just a couple of questions. Then I would like to open the discussion with our audience that I think is really interested to talk directly with you. And our first question is that you start this presentation with a photo of from your childhood in Sicily, in Ribera. And so I think that also in this book, it's here, there are traces also of a personal journey. And my question is, how did this your perspective change during when you were writing this book?
And also the importance
the perspective
of
on food, on food system.
Yeah, I think, so I was very lucky to do the work that I was doing for the BBC of making radio programs. But I think this is the problem, but also the blessing of a weekly program, is you get to tell a different story each week. For some reason, very early on when I came across the Ark of Taste, I don't know why, but I started to become obsessed with these stories of endangered foods. And I mean, something of a confession, really, that I was collecting them as individual stories, thinking, what a wonderful history, what a wonderful culture, a tradition, and perhaps this will disappear, but at least I should tell the story. It was only in writing the book that I had to make the connection between, for example, a type of tuber, a variety of potato in the Andes, and an orange growing in southwestern Sicily. What is the connection between these things? Why are they both endangered? And what happened in the world to create a situation in which more of the world's food is being grown in fewer centers, fewer big regions of production, and then being spread around the world? So it went from being a celebration of these individual stories to doing this really deep dive into the history of the global food system. And those are the connections. And I could then start to see this as a big picture. But I think I didn't want to just write this as a story of fragility in the supply chains around the world, or the risk of crop diseases. I think my childhood of experiencing something of Sicilian food culture also made me realize that there was an important cultural story to tell of this sense of identity we often have through food. And so I'm unburdened by not being a scientific writer, an academic, or even a farmer or a chef. I collect stories and I try and make sense of them. And that's what I did, informed partly by my own experience as well.
And staying focused on culture, we are all, the majority of us is very impressed when we see the extinction of an animal or an animal that is danger to be extincted. Why doesn't the same happens with food?
It's a very good question, and I would also, I'm just walking around the city here as well, admiring, even look at this spectacular, beautiful building we're in right now. And this is a reflection of how ingenious, how skillful humans can be, what we can create. I want to tell the story, how on earth did humans start in Mexico with a tiny, almost inedible plant called teosinte and end up with a corn of cob thousands of years later? That should be appreciated as much as a cathedral. It's a wonderful story of human endeavor and imagination. And it then shapes cultures because people realized they could not survive without the corn or that type of pig that was adapted to living in that particular landscape. So I think there is an interplay here between survival stories, cultural appreciation, and again, for the reasons I set out in the book, dominant cultures starting to take over and wipe out lots of the indigenous or distinctive cultures around the world.
And se ci sono domande, se io vado avanti, ci sono domande? There's a question there, ok. C'è una domanda laggiù. Ecco, sta arrivando il microfono. Un secondo.
If you want, I can speak in English, or it's up to you.
I can hear translations, maybe for the benefit of most people. Maybe you could ask in Italian.
No, ho qualche premessa da fare. Lei ha menzionato l'importanza della scienza.
Un attimo.
Sorry.
Perfetto. Lei ha menzionato l'importanza della scienza che ha adesso e che potrebbe e potrà avere nel futuro. Sappiamo che per diverse culture, in diverse parti del mondo abbiamo più breeding programs. Quindi la mia domanda è, basata sulla sua esperienza, quello che ha visto, qual è il livello con cui diverse popolazioni, diverse culture accettano questi nuovi breeding programs che sono alla base per far sopravvivere quel poco di biodiversità che ci rimane?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the best answer I can give is my own insights into one specific one. So I mentioned the story of wheat and the decline in the genetic diversity of wheat globally, particularly in the mid part of the 20th century. So recently, the funding agency in the UK, BBSRC, so it provides grant funding for lots of researchers for pioneering work. So they're thinking about 10, 20 years ahead. They've just allocated £50 million, so around 60 million euro, for crop research to try and bring diversity back into what farmers in Britain are growing. We have in Cambridge something called NIAB, which is the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. What they are doing is they're going back to the Fertile Crescent and finding the ancestors of wheat, which include a plant called goat grasses, wild goat grasses. And what they are effectively doing is taking wheat back through its evolutionary history before a lot of the so-called genetic bottlenecks to create a more diverse crop, so that when in the next decade or 2 decades, possibly sooner, we start to experience less predictable weather patterns in terms of rainfall or drought or maybe even too much rainfall at some times of the year. They are trying to create more diversity in the crop to give farmers more options than they currently have. So I see that as a recognition at a really serious level of a new generation of crop breeding that is focusing more, as much on diversity as on yield. And also I think that those crop breeding programs will also be increasingly interested in the quality of food as well. So because of the rising levels of public health problems, what we've done is we've taken the most precious historic food we've created, so the cereal crops, to produce types of that crop that are perfectly suited to refined processing, to become white flour, to be turned into multiple foods that aren't that good, that aren't healthy for us. I think increasingly the breeding programs will reflect the kinds of things that the science will tell us our bodies need. So I think planetary issues, climate change, public health issues are already feeding in to the future breeding programs. The risk I see is we again will think we've cracked the problem and we end up with just new types of monocultures.
Altre domande? C'è una domanda di qua. Vogliono far camminare.
Nice talk. Anche io sono siciliano e spesso quello che ho visto, almeno nella mia regione, è che la scienza, o comunque le scoperte più innovative, non vengono bene accettate da chi invece fa ancora agricoltura, magari in un modo un po' lontano dall'approccio scientifico. E generalmente in Europa, o almeno in Italia, e ad esempio pensando alla carne sintetica, che è stata subito bandita non appena è arrivato, la possibilità di sperimentare, è come se quell'innovazione scientifica fosse un pericolo per quello che già usiamo, che già mangiamo e per i prodotti più tipici, Come possiamo, secondo lei, legare gli aspetti della nostra tradizione agricola e della nostra tradizione sul cibo con l'innovazione scientifica? Come possiamo unire questi due aspetti insieme per fare in modo che sia quello che già abbiamo che quello che avremo in futuro sono in realtà parte dello stesso processo, come diceva lei, di innovazione scientifica, appunto perché il mais in realtà è un'invenzione. Grazie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. And I think part of the problem for me is that it isn't just about pure scientific innovation. It's often about in whose benefit is this scientific development, who is in control, who will benefit commercially. Therefore, I think this is a far more complicated situation in which, as you say, some developments are being viewed with great suspicion, and we know that with transgenics, and now with gene editing, and now with synthetic meats. And in some cases, I think the science moves far more quickly than many people would like, and also without those questions that I mentioned being asked, that who will be in control, who will benefit. I think the synthetic meat question, for me, is a good example of that. I mentioned the periodic table of food. So if we're just only beginning to glimpse the complexity of the food that currently exists and the diversity of chemical compounds that we interact with, and also different combinations of food, how is it that we can construct with that very limited science a type of food that could quite quickly spread around the world that is effectively a processed food without fully understanding what the impact will be long term in generations to come on our health? So I'm not saying that the ban is the right approach. I just think we should be challenging and questioning the science and asking, who is driving this forward? Do we know enough? Who will benefit? And who will be in control? It's like I mentioned with the story of the cheeses and the seeds. We end up with a situation, it seems, in our food system where a very small number of people exert huge amounts of control. And in the book, I'm arguing for diversity of all kinds. Diversity of foods, diversity of different food systems, and also an economic diversity, so we don't end up with high level of dependence on a small number of players in the food system.
Thank you. One question. This book is like an encyclopedia of foods, okay, of type of foods. But my question is this. Are we losing something, are we losing a lot also in terms of flavor, of taste? This is another thing that also brands and enterprises can be interested in the loss of taste and flavor.
Yeah, thanks for that description as well. And I'm sorry inevitably we end up with quite a tough conversation about why this matters so much. There is a huge amount of celebration and history, and as you say, it is almost like an encyclopedia of our different foods. But on that point, I think, the reason why the history matters as well is to, I guess, explain how did we get to the point we are in today, because most of us are so disconnected from our food that we don't actually end up being able to, I guess, interact with farmers or food producers. So our level of knowledge is very low. But I think in writing the book, I also wanted to provide a way in which people could feel that they could make an impact as well. With the information, with the knowledge, that they could act on this as well. So I think there's one story in the book of a rice farmer in China who was the last farmer in that region to save a particular red type of rice. And I arrived and he's in the middle of nowhere, and I'm thinking, how on earth are you making a living? How are you getting your rice to market? I can't see how you're doing that. And this farmer, who was in his 70s, took out his phone and showed me this app, WeChat. And he, from this remote part of China, was sending his rice out into different cities to people in Beijing and Chengdu. And I think we can all be involved in creating new supply chains, new networks. We can, in the words of Slow Food, become co-producers rather than just passive consumers. We can take far more control.
Ci sono altre domande? Okay, one more question. Also, you were talking about WeChat, and c'è una domanda? Okay.
Yeah.
We were talking about WeChat, and so I think that if we learn a little bit more about the history of our food, the tradition, the culture, also the taste, the flavor that every food have, we can change or transform or evolve our relationship with technology. Because, of course, also in the other question, there was this dichotomy between technology from one side and tradition from the other. Maybe this vision doesn't work. We need to find a new mix, a balance between these two things. Do you agree with this?
Yeah. And sorry, because I didn't fully finish the previous answer. The reason why the people wanted that rice was because of the flavor and the taste of that rice, which had been lost from so many other types of rice. I started off by saying I think science and technology are the reasons I now have for optimism. In that I think a lot of the, as I mentioned, the reductionist breakthroughs that we had, so 1909, Haber-Bosch process, the new synthetic fertilizers, the emerging science of crop breeding also at the beginning of the 20th century, the green revolution, that new endeavor that really unfolds in the 60s and 70s. I think the science we're now seeing now when it comes to I mentioned gut microbiome, but there's also the soil microbiome. I think this is powerful information that will show us that not only that complexity exists and that diversity has been an important part of our story, but also I'm convinced we will find ways in which we can create more complex production systems where we can use the soil microbiome instead of industrial fertilizers using lots of fossil fuels. So I think what we really need is the future policymakers to be listening to the people who are doing that science. So I think politics and policy and science really need to come together rather than just allowing market forces to dictate the global food system.
Thank you. So to end the question before, how does
On
it taste
flavour?
that rice?
Yeah, and I think,
Can you describe this taste?
well,
to us? So we
I,
just to have an idea.
I found this really difficult when I was writing the book
Yeah.
to describe flavors. But, you know, again, I think there's just complexity in these. So I think the Green Revolution rices, for example, that then took over in India and China, they were seen as the solution to ending famine. But wherever the farmers, and they found ingenious ways to get the new Green Revolution seeds to the farmers. You know, they would use wedding celebrations, for example, and they would make it available so that people were coming together and they would go back to their villages with the same kind of rice. But wherever those new rice varieties were grown, the farmer would always be keeping a patch of the traditional rice. Not only because of the distinctive flavors, but they also saw this food as medicine. That if their wife was pregnant, they would want to feed that particular rice to their wife. Or if somebody was ill, that type of rice would be the one that they would go for as well. Rather than being faced with uniformity, they kept their own seed banks in a sense, and they kept the diversity in the field. And I think one of the most important, powerful sensory tools that we have are our palates. That throughout history we have been able to sense what is good for us, whether it's bitterness, which is now disappearing in many parts of the world, less so in Italy, interestingly. And in a sense, the problem with a lot of the now ultra-processed foods is they are so powerful in their construction of fitting our basic palates. I think we're losing the skill of being able to taste. So in Victorian England, it was possible to eat an apple a day for 4 years without eating the same apple twice. There was that much diversity. We now have 4 or 5 in the supermarkets. And people understood which apple to bring out during a particular meal, almost like a bottle of wine. Yeah. And they would also know how to keep an apple so that it was perfect to taste at a particular time of year. So I think we've almost lost the skill of taste in some parts of the world. And again, I think I've heard concerns being expressed about a younger generation of Italians. Yeah. But I think that the culture here is so deep, and I think relationship with land and food much stronger than in my part of Europe, that I hope that skill and that sensory experience and that relationship with food continues, because the consequences otherwise are terrible.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry to end up on a negative note.
No, it's a good way. It depends on how you approach this problem. You can. Yeah. I think that it's an opportunity. We have an opportunity.
Absolutely.
We have technology. We have many innovation. We have heritage. We have a lot of ingredients in our culture so we can move on and change things.
And I think there are many entrepreneurs and there are many people innovating in food and farming as well. Each one of the stories I tell of an endangered food also has a hero in the story of somebody who is saving that food and taking it into the future. Again, another reason for optimism is that human spirit, really, that determination to save what is distinctive about where we happen to be on this planet.
Thank you, Dan Saladino, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And so, see you next year.
Yeah. Thank you. Grazie. Grazie molto.
Thank you.